Okay, so 2 weeks ago I made this video with this title. Bigger brakes do not reduce your stopping distance. They can stop your car sooner. And I got a overwhelming number of comments from people saying that the statement in the video title is untrue. And this is because bigger brake discs, which are present in big brake kits, do in fact reduce your stopping distance because they increase the leverage on the wheel hub. A larger disc puts the point where you grab the disc further away from the center, and this increases your leverage and thus your brake torque at the wheel hub, which then stops the car sooner because you have increased the braking force. Some people even got pretty emotional and worked up about the video. Honestly, I don't mean to be patronizing, but if a video about brakes can get you this worked up, then I think it's a good idea to seek some help to try and resolve the underlying issues that you might have. So due to the large number of comments, I decided that a response, a follow-up video was necessary to clear some of these things up and explain in more detail why the statement of the video is true. So as you can see, I'm in a car and I'm driving around a place where it's safe to do this. As you may have noticed, I've just locked up the wheels and triggered ABS on this car. And this is an absolutely tiny, the opposite of a sports car, completely stock 2009 Toyota Aygo. It has 247mm discs in the front and drum brakes in the back. This is a braking system which some in the comment section might choose to describe as weak or inadequate. In fact, many commenters imply that stock systems on vehicles are somehow weak and do not have sufficient braking force. This is untrue, and it has been untrue for the past, I think, 40 to 50 years. And this is because pretty much all the countries in the world have legislation in place which clearly defines how much braking force a particular vehicle must have for its mass and engine output. And this amount of braking force defined is always more than enough to lock up the wheels. This was taken a step further in 2004 in Europe, where ABS became mandatory, and in 2012 in the United States, where ABS together with electronic stability control also became mandatory on all cars sold in Europe and in the United States. And obviously, to trigger the anti-lock braking systems, you must have more than enough braking force to lock up the wheels so that the anti-lock system can come into play. And if your country isn't in the European Union or your country isn't the United States, then it's probably a signatory of one of the regulations of the United States, United Nations Economic and Social Council, which put great importance on braking force. They clearly define it, and they also define the amount of redundancy that must be present in the braking system. So no matter how much money you have for the past 40-ish years, it has been impossible to go out and purchase a vehicle which has inadequate braking force.
Of course, this legislation isn't surprising because brakes are the single most important thing on a vehicle when it comes to safety. Being able to stop is more important than anything else. This is why annual or biannual vehicle registration technical inspections have zero tolerance for even a hint of malfunction on brake systems. And this is why brake failures on vehicles are extremely rare. I'm sure that as car or motorcycle owners, most of us have experienced all sorts of malfunctions with our vehicles, anything from minor electrical gremlins to complete engine failures. But I'm certain that the percentage of drivers and riders that have experienced a complete braking system failure while driving or riding is zero, or at least extremely close to zero.
I know they don't look like much, but believe me, they have more than enough power to get the job done. So that's point number one. A lack of braking force does not exist on vehicles today. Point number two is that increasing that braking force further cannot reduce your braking distance. And that is because your tires are the only point of contact between the rest of your car and the road surface. They're the only thing touching the ground. And once you overcome the grip, the traction capabilities of your tires, then increasing brake force cannot reduce your stopping distance. Once you overcome what the tires can do, there's nothing else left to overcome. That's it. Think of a person trying to walk on ice and they keep falling down. Do you think that increasing the strength of the leg muscles would help the person keep the balance? No, what would help the person would be a better sense of balance, and this too can be sort of linked to cars, because changing the weight transfer, changing things on your suspension can in fact reduce your braking distance. But once you overcome what the tires can do, then increasing the braking force either via increased clamping force or increased leverage cannot reduce your braking distance. And as we have just explained, every car you can purchase has more than enough braking force to overcome what the tires can do. This is why we have ABS. Now, many people did point out the issue with tire traction in the comment section of the previous video, but in many cases it triggered an avalanche of responses where the argument was a single subjective personal example. Something along the lines of, I bought a big brake kit for my insert car here and I can definitely confirm that it reduced my stopping distance. Now, I get this on my channel a lot. Some people believe that a single subjective personal example and experience somehow constitutes a statistic and a universally applicable rule. Of course, we know that isn't the case, but I'll go out on a limb here. I'll believe that you did proper testing of your old versus your new brake system. I'll believe that you did at least 10 brake tests and then took the average of them. I'll believe that you did it on the same road surface and in similar ambient conditions. I'll assume all of that. But the problem is that you were testing a used brake system versus a brand new one. Maybe you had improperly bedded brake pads. Maybe you had brake pads and discs worn out of spec. Maybe you had air in your brake fluid. Maybe you had old, degraded, deformed rubber brake lines. Many things on a brake system can influence the way it performs and feels. And then all of them get reset when you do a brake upgrade. It's obvious from the comments on my previous video that many people associate brakes with friction force, friction strength, but a much more sensible perception would be to associate them with heat sinks, because that's what brakes on cars and other vehicles really are. They're heat sinks. When you try to stop your car with your brakes, what you're doing is converting kinetic energy into heat. That's what your brakes do, and then they dissipate that heat into the surrounding air.
Here's an interesting little piece of information. The amount of heat released by an average car during a single braking instance from a speed of 90 kilometers per hour is enough to boil 2 liters of water in just 3 seconds. All stock systems on all cars today are capable of dissipating this much heat at least 4 to 5 times before significant brake fade occurs. This means that you can accelerate from 0 to 90, panic brake to a stop, then accelerate to 90 again, panic brake again, and repeat this cycle at least 4 times before significant brake fade can be measured. And even once brake fade starts, it will be small and gradual, and getting your stock brakes to fade to the point where they can't lock up the wheels anymore and trigger ABS is next to impossible. This means that driving on the street cannot overheat or overpower the stock braking system. In fact, if you ever need multiple panic brakes in a row while driving in public roads, then there's something very wrong with your driving. Now we're going to compare 3 very different cars to illustrate the extent to which modern cars don't have a problem with braking. Our first car is the McLaren Senna. This is an 800 horsepower hypercar with absolutely amazing state-of-the-art carbon brakes. It has 390mm discs and 6 piston fixed calipers in the front. It gets from 0 to 100 km per hour in just 2.6 seconds. Our second car is the Mazda MX-5 ND. It has 280mm discs and single piston floating calipers in the front. The 2-liter model gets from 0 to 100 km per hour in just under 7 seconds. The final car is my very own 2009 Toyota Aygo, which has 247mm discs and single piston floating calipers in the front. It gets from 0 to 100 km per hour in 14.2 seconds. So as you can see, we have staggering differences in brake systems and acceleration times, but not so much when it comes to braking distances. The Senna manages to come to a stop from a speed of 100 km per hour in 30 meters. The ND MX-5 manages 38.8 meters, and the Aygo manages 35 meters. So the McLaren Senna has 57% larger brake discs than the Aygo, and it has 6 times the number of caliper pistons. It's also 446% faster from 0 to 60 than the Aygo, but it is only 16% faster from 60 to 0. The Mazda MX-5 is also available with 1.5-liter engines in some markets, and these models get smaller brake discs. What's interesting is that almost all tests measured either the same braking distance for both models or slightly shorter braking distances for the models with 1.5-liter engines. Of course, the reason behind this is that the models with the smaller engines have a less overall mass. Something else you might be wondering about is the weight of our three vehicles, and it is pretty similar across all three cars. So why is this the case? Why doesn't a $1 million hypercar dramatically outbrake a cheap little city car? The reason is that technology has long since reached the sensible limit of braking force. Getting to a stop from 100 km per hour in 35 meters takes less than 3 seconds, and this in turn exposes you to forces of nearly 1 G, which is the limit of what the average driver can sustain on their body and still retain full control of their car. Now, engineers are more than capable of making vehicles with ridiculous stopping distances. For example, the F2004, which is Ferrari's Formula 1 car for the 2004 season, can come to a stop from 100 km per hour in just 16 meters. That's more than 2 Gs of force. Of course, Formula 1 drivers are highly trained athletes capable of taking these loads easily. On the other hand, 2 Gs would make some average drivers lose control of their vehicle. In fact, F1 cars can generate as high as 5 Gs of force when braking hard from high speeds. That's the sort of deceleration that can make some people pass out. In fact, if you look at the average braking distances of all car categories, you will see that they don't differ that much from each other. Hypercars and sports cars have the shortest braking distances not because they have the biggest discs and calipers, but because they have the most favorable ratio of weight to tire size and width. Hypercars have giant brakes and calipers because they need big heat sinks to dissipate the ridiculous heat that is generated when braking from the kinds of speeds that hypercars can reach, and because these cars are supposed to be capable of some serious track duty. As I said in the previous video, one of the few times when a brake upgrade should be considered is when you reach the limits of the heat sink capabilities of stock brakes. The kind of driving that is required to reach these limits is pretty much impossible on public roads and will lead to an accident within a short amount of time. Aggressive, prolonged track driving is one of the few instances that require a brake upgrade, and this too only when you actually manage to get the brakes hot enough to reach and feel the point of significant brake fade and loss of braking performance due to overheating. If you can't overheat the stock system, then you have not reached the limits of its performance and don't really need to upgrade your brakes. In fact, most sports and sporty cars will be fine on the track with just a brake pad upgrade. Most hot hatches today come out of the factory with brakes that will satisfy what 90% of all the owners can actually do on the track. The other scenario when a brake upgrade is necessary is if you dramatically increase the mass of your car or do a lot of towing, especially downhill.
The only other scenario where a brake upgrade might be necessary is if you're dramatically increasing the power output of your vehicle. For example, let's imagine that I swap out this 68 horsepower 1K RFE engine with, let's say, a Toyota 2ZZ GE engine with 190 horsepower. In that case, my top speed would likely increase from the stock 160 on a good day to north of 200 kilometers per hour. Obviously, the stock braking system is not designed to dissipate the heat that would be generated during repeated braking from much higher speeds than stock. In that case, upgrading your brakes is a good idea.
I believe that one of the key reasons why many car enthusiasts have a positive attitude towards upgrades and mods and a negative attitude towards stock parts is that many of us grew up playing games like Need for Speed Underground and similar, where a stock car is the absolute starting point or the rock bottom of performance, and where every little quote-unquote upgrade to anything on the car yields some sort of improvement. Remember how buying whatever increases your top speed or your acceleration or handling. This mentality was then further reinforced by companies in the aftermarket who often try to convince potential customers how stock equals weak, inadequate, or poorly designed. The poorly designed is especially offensive when you take into account that OEMs have giant budgets and can afford to hire the best engineers, which are then instructed to create parts which fit the widest range of applications as well as possible. The reality is that 90% of car enthusiasts fit within all the possible applications that a modern hot hatch can perform well, and 90% of car enthusiasts do not have the driving skill or the experience to harness even close to the limits of what a modern hot hatch can do. Despite that, we can often see people today buying a brand new hot hatch or sports car and modifying it extensively from day one without ever getting a feel for the stock car. Basically, they're recreating the same scenario from the games we played when growing up. I definitely don't want to be patronizing, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with modifying your car the way you want to. I'm 100% supportive of anyone doing anything they enjoy as long as this does not harm others in any way. There's of course nothing wrong with upgrading your brakes purely for the aesthetics and filling out the wheel and doing something you want to do. But whether this is something you need to do from a functional perspective is an entirely different matter. In reality, significant brake upgrades would likely end up very much near the bottom of the list of objectively necessary upgrades for a car that is trying to reach ever higher levels of all-around performance. The other potential issue is that brake upgrades are the easiest to get wrong. This is because fitting big fixed multi-piston calipers on a car that previously had tiny single-piston floaters can dramatically upset things like your brake feel and brake bias. The stock system is designed around the ratio between your stock master cylinder and stock caliper pistons. Modifying this ratio can definitely improve brake feel near the limit of tire traction, the spot where tires grip the best. But getting this ratio wrong can result in brakes that feel like they lock the tires immediately and offer very poor brake modulation. But as we know, brake upgrade kits almost never contain different master cylinders. It's just brackets, discs, calipers, pads, and brake lines. The math of hydraulic ratios and brake bias is up to you. By the way, if you're interested, I can cover topics like brake bias, proportioning valves, and master cylinders and piston ratios more extensively in the future. Let me know if you want to see some of that in the comments.
Now, as an ending point to the video, let's come back to the issue of increased braking torque via increased leverage from larger brake discs. For a moment, let's imagine that we do not have sufficient braking force to lock up the wheels and that we need more braking force. So larger discs, how much can they increase the braking force? Well, the average car outputs anywhere between 800 to 1,200 Newton meters of braking torque from a single front wheel. Now, when increasing brake discs, we can usually not increase them more than 20 to 30 millimeters, and this is because we're limited by how much brake disc we can squeeze under a reasonably sized wheel when we also take the brake caliper into account. And increasing the brake discs by around 20 to 30 millimeters increases the braking torque by only about 50 Newton meters. This is less than what you need to tighten the cylinder head bolts on most engines. It's what you can easily output with your hands with a pretty small lever. And when you put it into perspective of, trying to stop a car that's moving at high speeds, then 50 Newton meters of extra torque really is negligible and doesn't change things much. A different example where increased leverage can increase braking force is bicycles. We have 26, 27, 28-inch wheels, and the distance between disc brakes, which are at the center of the wheel, and rim brakes, which are on the outer edge of the wheel, is pretty significant. And this is why rim brakes on bicycles can offer adequate braking force even without relying on the augmentation of that force provided by hydraulic ratios. But on cars, again, we do not have this luxury. We have to fit everything inside the wheel, and this is why we cannot increase brake force significantly with larger brake discs. However, what we can do is change the perception of braking for the driver, because a circle is easier to stop the further out you're grabbing from the center. The driver may perceive increased brake discs as requiring less braking effort to get the wheels to lock up. However, the braking distance will remain the same. So yeah, there you go. Some numbers and data to hopefully offer additional insight into brakes and why they're not as simple and intuitive as one might think. Yeah, that's pretty much it for today. As always, thanks all for watching, and I'll be seeing you soon with more fun and useful stuff on the D4A channel.